Previously, I set up a SOP HDA version of the building, and I created a viewer state for this HDA, and now I'll add the first functionality using the viewer state. I'm going to treat this part of the network which we have just created as a unique network. To do this, I'll separate the output node, and I'll cap off the network using a null. I'll give this null the name structure out. I'll start my new network next to this network, and I'll do this by getting an object merge node. This will be connected to the output, and in the object merge node I'll reference my structure out. The first node can then be added to this branch of the network, and this node will be a group node, and after the group node I'm going to add a color node. For the moment I'll call the group test group. I will also set the group name as $OS. This group will be a primitive group, so I do not need to change anything. In the color node I'm then going to reference this group, so the group for the color node will be test group. I want to specify that the group type is a primitive group, and I want to make sure that I'm coloring primitives. I will also specify that this will be a red color. The color itself doesn't really matter, but red should be easy to see. All of my geometry should now become red. I can now return to the group node. If I specify a single primitive here, that primitive will now be colored red. We do have an issue that everything is added to the group when the group is empty. However, we do have the main functionality that I want here, which is the ability to specify a specific primitive and then have an operation performed on that primitive. In this case, it is adding color to the primitive. I'm going to add this group to my interface, so I'll open the type properties, and I'll drag and drop the base group parameter onto the parameters tab. I'll separate this parameter using a folder, and I'll call this folder test. This is of course all temporary, but I will convert this into something more permanent as we develop features with it. But for the moment, I'm going to use this to add the initial functionality within the viewer state. This viewer state is already registered with this node, and we can check this under the node tab, and the state is registered in my default state parameter. I can now edit my default state. Currently, the state does not do much. We have two event handles, on enter and on exit, and both of these will print out the name of the event handles. I'll begin with when we enter the node, and here I'm going to add some member variables. I'll begin with self.node, which is a reference to the current node which I'm working on, and we'll get this with quargs using the argument node. After this, I'm going to create a variable for my test group, and this will be self.testgroup. I'll set this using a parameter from our node with node.palm, and here I'll need to specify the name of my group. So I'm going to return to Houdini and we can look at the group. Currently this group is still called base group, and I'm going to rename this. This will now be called test group. I'll also give this the label test group. I'll apply it to save the changes, and then I'll return to the script. And the parameter that we're now going to find will be the test group. I'm then going to create a new event handle, and this will be called onSelection. This is of course defined as part of the viewer state. It will take two arguments. The first will be self, and the second will be quargs. This group will need a return value, and for the moment I'll return false. There are numerous selection options available for the viewer states, and there are a number of event handles. We can examine these in the type properties for our node by going to the interactive tab and opening the wizard to create a new viewer state. And there are 4 items which we can use for selection, of which we are currently going to be using onSelection. So I can return to working on the scripts. I'll also be working with the help here. So this will be under the Python scripting help. Generally we would work with the main reference for Houdini, but there are specific sections dealing with viewer states here, and the appropriate section here at the moment would be state selections. Here I'll look at binding a geometry selector, and what I actually want from this section is a reference for the selection event handlers. Here we'll get a reference of arguments, and these will be arguments which are appropriate for this handler, which are stored within the quargs dictionary. The first of these, which is most applicable to us, will be the selection, and I'll create a variable called selection for this. I will not really be using the drawable selection at the moment, but I do want the name, and this will also have a variable dedicated to it. I'll then want to store the value from the selection into these variables. For the selection, I'll use quargs with the key selection. The name will be quargs with the key name. We will need to test that this is working, and to do this I'll print out the selection. However, in order to get a selection, we'll need to define what we are selecting first. This is going to be done using the bind geometry selector. This is specifically used for selecting geometry, and this is opposed to, for example, the bind object selector, which would be used in the object context for selecting objects, and this would be used in an object viewer state, where the bind geometry selector will usually be used in a SOP viewer state. For what I'm working with here, we'll want to look at the bind geometry selector option. I'll copy the entire declaration for the bind geometry selector, and this can now be added to the script. This will be added in the create viewer state template function. I will do this after I bind my icons. I can now create my selector, and I'll do this with template.bind geometry selector. The first argument for this function will be our prompt. The prompt will be a string. This string will be seen at the bottom of the viewport, and it will tell you what action the tool is going to perform. I'll set the string to be select a primitive. This will be followed by allow drag. I'm going to leave this as false. This will determine whether you can use drag in selections. For example, your lasso selections. I'll be selecting a single item at a time, so I'll leave this as false. Quick select affects how your selection is performed. This is to do with how the selection is updated. When this is true, the selection will be updated dynamically, and when it's false, the selection should be updated at the end of the selection session, and I'll leave this set at true. Next we'll have auto start. Auto start means that this selection should be active as soon as we enter the viewer state. If you want to have multiple selections and have them driven by shortcut keys, we'll generally turn this off for most of them. Essentially, this will be the default selection method. This will be followed by the toolbox. The toolbox will give us the selection tools at the top of the viewport. So if we look at the viewer state, these are the toolbox tools, and this string at the bottom here will be our prompt. The next option will be whether we're using the existing selection. This will base our selection off the group box. I'll set this to be false for the moment. So initially we'll start the selection using a brand new selection every time. This is something which I may change in the future. Consume selection is similar. However, this occurs at the end of the tool. When we complete our selection, this will remove the selection from the current selection. If this is set to false, we should maintain the selection after we have the viewer state. I'll leave this as true for the moment. The next option is secure selections. This relates to how we interact with the viewport, and it's used to prevent accidental selections when using a tool. I will not change this for the moment. However, that can cause issues, so we probably will change this later. This will be followed by the initial selection. Currently this is empty, and I'm not going to change this. We'll then have the initial selection type. This is currently set to primitives, which is exactly what I want, so I'll leave this. I'll leave this unordered. We'll then get to our geometry types. We can actually set up selections that will work on multiple types of geometry. So for example, we could set this to work on edges and points, but not primitives. Or we can get this to work on edges, points, and primitives. However, in this case, I only want this to select primitives. The primitive types will give us a list. I'll add one item to this list, and this will be who.geometrytype.primitive. After this, we'll get more control of the type of primitives we add. In this case, I'll set this to be who.primitivetypes.polygon. Although at the moment, I can actually leave this empty, and I can update this later if necessary. I will only be selecting geometry within the currently selected SOP. We can allow this to select any visible geometry. That's not usually the best idea to start with though. I will not add a hotkey yet, although this can be done. Finally, I'll give the selection a name, and this name will be test selection. The selections are named because it is possible to have numerous selection methods, and we'll use this name to identify which selection method we are using. This selection can now be used, and this will be used as our selection in the onSelection method, and currently we are already printing this out, so we do not need to add any extra tests here. This should complete my selection, so I can return to Houdini to test this. I'll go to my viewer state browser. I'll need to work on the SOP viewer state. I'll right click on the viewer state and I'll reload it. I can then test this by pressing enter in the viewport, and I get an error. I'm setting my test group incorrectly. Here I'm attempting to reference the node, but the node is actually a member variable, so this should be self.node. I can reload my state now, and I no longer have any errors. I can then test again, but I'm not able to make my selection. So I'm going to update my script again, and in this case I'm going to set secure selection to ignore. This will remove any lock-in from my selections. I'll return to Houdini and I'll reload the script. I now get my pick session, and I'm able to select my primitives. When I select an individual item, I'll have the point number printed out. I can also hold down Shift to select multiple items, and in this case this will give me a range-based selection. If I click on empty space, I'll clear out my selection. This is something which we should take into account, because getting nothing is actually a result, so we should handle that as a case. So we've got a selection, and it currently does nothing. Now we'll want to use this selection. So now I want to use this selection to set our group parameter. This parameter will essentially be our base group. The first thing that I'm going to deal with is having nothing selected. To do this, I'll have a conditional. This will be if, and then I'll check for the length of my selection. I'll do this with selection.selections. Now it can simultaneously have more than one selection, so we'll need to specify a selection here. So the selections is actually an array of selections, and we want a selection from this array, and the selection that we're going to look for is our first selection. To get this, we'll use the index 0. I'll then test if this length is equal to 0. If we have a selection of 0, I'll then print out nothing selected. There is another way of printing out, and this will print out directly to our ViewState browser, and this is part of the debugging tools within the ViewState browser, and this will be to use self.log. I can print nothing selected here as well. I can then return false. If I return false, I should be able to continue with the selection. If I return true, that should end the selection session. I can then update my group. I'll do this with self.testGroup. I'll then use the set method on this group. The temptation here will be to set this with our selection. However, this will not work, and this is despite the fact that our selection prints out the correct value. I'll move the printout of my selection before the statement, and we can then test the statement. I'll reload the ViewState. I can then enter the state and make a selection, and I get an error. In this case, I've made a mistake with my selection. I've specified an index, and this is important for the selection itself, but here I'm not actually returning a selection at all, so I should be testing if we have no selections, so I can remove the index. I can save this and I can test again, and once again I'll get an error, and this is the expected error with the selection, and this will give us an error with a Houdini geometry selection. So now I want to get something more usable from our selection, and to do this I'm going to use the method mergedSelectionString. This should convert our selection into a string, and this string should be formatted to be usable within a group field. This does have options for formatting the string. However, I will not set any of those, as this should be enough for our current usage. I can return to Houdini, and I can reload the ViewState. I should now be able to select items for my group in the viewport, and if I hold Shift, I should be able to select multiple items for the group. I'm now able to select items for my group in the viewport, and the next step will be to use this group for something that's actually useful.